Right, well, look, thank you everybody for taking your time to join us today at the latest At the Coalface webinar. Today's webinar is about fraud, reputation and the court of public opinion. Thank you for giving up an hour of your time. I appreciate giving up an hour for the amount of content that there is out there at the moment. It's quite a lot of time, so thank you for doing that for us to come along for this session. Now, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Arun Chauhan. I'm the director, founder, essentially the managing partner of this law firm, Tenet. We're a law firm that specialises with disputes and investigations and compliance arising out of fraud and financial crime. Really on the dispute side, we do a lot of work around misrepresentation claims in terms of asset acquisition, employee fraud, supplier fraud claims, breach of director duties and so on. Issues around tax, money laundering and customer fraud issues in terms of financial services. Now, our position as a firm is we are a mid-market practice, really disputes up to about £15 million. We're conflict-free, working domestic and internationally. Quite proud that we're named Law Firm of the Year this year at the Birmingham Law Society Awards for employees. Law firms up to 50 employees. And we recently were highly commended at the LexisNexis Awards for Dispute Resolution Team of the Year 2026. Enough about us. Let's talk about today. So, At the Coalface. The aim of the At the Coalface webinars, is our 14th I think now, is to speak to people at the front line dealing with fraud and financial crime issues, so we can learn from their experience and apply them to our practice, or about people out there we're speaking to who can help you in circumstances where you have need. In previous episodes we spoke to investigative journalists, we've spoken about the language of fraud, we've spoken about fraud in sport in our last episode with Johnny Gray, and examples of those episodes have just been popped in the chat by my colleague Paula. Today we're really lucky to be joined by Giles Kenningham MBE of Trafalgar Strategy. Giles, thanks for giving up time. Perhaps you can just give a short introduction about yourself.
Yeah, look, thanks for having me on. Really looking forward to the conversation. So yeah, I'm Giles Kenningham. I'm the founder of Trafalgar Strategy. We are a PR and public affairs company who operate at the intersection of where politics meets business meets media. Before I founded Trafalgar, I was head of press, spokesman to the UK Prime Minister between 2013 to 2016. Before that, I was a special advisor to a cabinet minister, and then in a previous life, I was a producer for ITV News across their main three programmes.
That's great, Johnson. I think if we're being quite precise, it was David Cameron was the PM at the time of your tenureship. Yeah, brilliant. Well, thank you for giving up time. I know you are in demand. Now, some housekeeping and an overview of what we're going to cover today. Those of you who've been here before, you know the drill. You'll get your playback of the episode. If you've registered, we had about 170 people registered today, so usually get about half of them show up for the live session and then they get the playback. You'll get a PDF, an ebook about the learnings of today's session and more information about Trafalgar Strategy and the opportunity to connect with Giles after the event. A feedback form will be popped in the chat as well at some point. We always want to hear about what other subjects people would like to have talked about here. And as always, we have the motion-censored light issue I have in the office where we are environmental friendly. So the lights will go off, I'll shake my hands, the lights will come back on, and that will become some kind of little video we put out on the internet later. Now, Giles and I are going to talk over 5 broad topics for about 45, maybe 50 minutes, and then have some time for Q&A and chat, and then we'll get you away by 2 o'clock. Now, the 5 topics are going to be the courtroom of public opinion, why public sentiment can influence the outcomes before legal proceedings conclude. Second subject is what you say matters, how organisations should respond when fraud and financial crime allegations emerge. Fake news is our third subject, and false allegations, how to deal with the instance of fake news. There's so much going out now with AI. It's a fast-paced media environment. How can people like Trafalgar Strategy and Giles get you ahead of the narrative and keep control of it? The joys of long-standing regulatory engagement. Media coverage is very quick. Regulatory and criminal engagement takes a long time. How do you manage that process during such a long period of time is our 4th topic. And then when you come out the other side, rebuilding reputation. How do you go through that? How do you deal with serious allegations after the event and bring yourself back to the surface in one piece? So let's make a start. The courtroom of public opinion, really just the first subject here about, there are plenty of examples where public opinion has got ahead before instances have come out. So I know just even in our own world, the law firm world, there's the law firm group PM Law. It's said that some nearly £40 million is missing out of the client's account. investigations are ongoing. We've got memories of Axiom Ints in the background where there's been misappropriation or alleged misappropriation of client funds. No decisions yet, but I think people are already forming a view before there's even been a full regulatory investigation or criminal sanctions. In the US, if you look at a much bigger sphere, Theranos, remember the blood testing kind of technology scandal, public opinion led and drove legal decisions followed in that case. And Elizabeth Holmes was convicted of investor fraud. Now, I want to kind of bring this to life, Giles, if we could. Being called out for dishonest actions, being alleged, make allegations coming against you in relation to deceiving people. We see it a lot in politics. We're seeing it now, aren't we, with Starmer and Mandelson. We saw it at Partygate with Boris Johnson. It can really lead to causing real trouble for their tenureship. Why is it that this subject area, fraud, financial crime, why is it dishonesty, for example, in politics? What is the big grab in public opinion about this subject area, about people lying?
Yeah, look, I think we live in a world now where scandals happen a lot quicker. If you look at Watergate, it took them almost a year or over a year to break that story. Whereas now, stories can get broken overnight. And why is that? It's because everyone can be a journalist and everyone has access to journalists through social media platforms. Why is the Starmer Mandelson row so damaging? Because if you poll people, trust in public institutions, businesses is already at an all-time low, which explains the rise of sort of the less sort of stereotypical politicians like Trump. And the way the Mandelson-Starmer saga has been handled has just made it worse. You know, as ever, it's the cover-up which does for people, not necessarily the allegations. And if you take that as a case study, part of the issue is that once this whole story blew up in September 2025, what they should have said, what the government should have said is, look, we're going to get all the facts and we're going to put them out all at once. And they should have put out a holding statement. Instead, what happened was they bowed to this tsunami of media pressure and they put out a statement. They didn't put out all the facts, didn't have all the facts to hand. So what you've had now is this drip, drip, drip of allegations, more information coming out. It's kept the story going. It looks like the government wasn't being transparent and wasn't telling the truth. And then allied to that, what you've had is a series of more junior members of staff being sacked, thrown under the bus. It looks like there's a lack of accountability at the top. And I think this is something which you can also apply to businesses. So I think, we'll come on to this later, but we are now in an environment whereby I think for people who want to remain, if you have an organization, if you are a high net worth individual, you have to have some information about yourself online, which is from verified social media platforms or news sources. So you say to people, look, that is the truth, and that is from a credible news source. Otherwise, people will make stuff up about you. But also, I think, especially for big organizations, when they have strong media, strong followings, a strong presence on different online platforms, it means in the middle of a crisis, they can get their message out to people and say, this is where you get the unfiltered truth.
And when it comes to that, not front loading and saying, look, we're going to get all our facts in order. We're going to look at this as an investigation. We're going to come back to you, the public, with all the answers at the same time, rather than the drip feed.
Yeah.
I said back onto this point that where that sentiment of trust is being broken, and that's the feeling in the public of the opinion when they see these news stories, be it with politics or in business. Is the sentiment as simple as, look, treat us as adults, as the reader, as the consumer of this public opinion? Is that the problem? Do you think business leaders, politicians?
Yeah, and I actually think the public would be a lot more forgiving than people think. The problem for politicians and business leaders is when they don't know the answer to something, they're saying, I do not know, but I'll have to get back to you on that. I don't have that information at my fingertips, but what I do know is this. The issue is always where there's the cover-up, the obfuscation, that people don't expect politicians to be perfect. People don't expect business people to know everything all at once. I think most people would say if they get through their daily lives, whatever sort of job or walk of life they're in, if they get 70, 80% of things right, that's a really good run rate. As ever, it's just not being candid with people. Everyone knows that people aren't perfect. And I think people expect politicians to be perfect, and they certainly aren't. and they don't have all the answers. And I think people respect that candor, which is what I was saying at the start. I'm not advocating for Trump or Boris Johnson, but their rise to the top was a reaction to those identical, stereotypical politicians who spoke in anodyne soundbites. People wanted more free-flowing, free-speaking people, because people have had enough of effectively feeling like they're being duped or just being given stock answers.
And where sometimes you said, like this point, you said, throwing junior people under the bus, and we've seen that in certainly in cases where, if we look through, like in the history, look at the libel scandal. You had senior bank officials were being placed under scrutiny, and what they said was, well, look, I didn't directly know about this. These junior people at the end of the business were the ones who had the knowledge, were involved. If an organisation comes to you and say, look, we've got this fraud allegation, there's some allegations at the top, is that part of, dare I say, the game? Is part of the game is to, well, actually, right, how do we preserve your credibility, leaders, senior politicians? Is that a strategy? Let's throw people under the bus. I mean, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that. Quite a cynical take on Aaron, but no, totally get where you're coming from. I think, I think people come to us. There has to be full transparency about what's going on. There has to be a timetable set out for what they're going to do when. There has to be the investigation, has to be a conclusion to that. I think, just a wider point to step back on this with organizations. I think our advice to most organizations is you can preempt most crisis, right? So you will know, you should have what we call a war book, basically a Q&A, answers for all the different eventualities. So that could be if you're hit by a cyber attack, if you're hit by a data leak, if you're hit by a whistleblower, if you have very unfortunately any sexual assault claims being made in the firm, if you had a rogue employee, you should have a sort of war book which sets out what you're going to do when. And in these situations, it's speed which is important. Now, not everyone, as I said, going back to what I was saying earlier before, expects you to have the answers, but you can react quickly by saying, look, we're fully investigating this, we're compiling the facts, we are gripping this situation and ensuring there is some transparency, but also filling that media vacuum at the start to show that you are on top of things. If you don't fill that vacuum, someone else will. So I think it's doing that. As I said, I think you can get a lot of, in those, and often, you can't be setting out your strategy for a crisis in the middle of a crisis, right? So in these situations, it's like, what's the sign-off procedure? Who's going to be going on the media if you are? Who's the public statement going to be coming from? How are you going to communicate to your stakeholders so they hear it from you first, certainly? And how are you going to communicate to your staff? Because often we see in crisis situations, part of the problem is the internal comms are really poor. Then you have more damaging information leaking out from staff. So, you need to be communicating with them regularly. Now, of course, what you say publicly should also be reflective of what you say privately, because if there's a discrepancy, you make things worse. And of course, you have to work on the assumption that if you're a big organization, like a Tesco's or a big multinational, that information still might leak out, but you're happy with it. But nonetheless, we still advise those internal comms and how ultimately your staff are your part of your PR. It's incredibly important about how you treat them and ensure there is a level of transparency there.
Yeah, it's a really interesting risk area, isn't it? Because I really like that phrase about, what you're going to say publicly should be essentially mirrored in what you say privately within the organisation as well. Because you want to have that united front. And you just mentioned Tesco, actually, because that kind of neatly takes on to, what happens if allegations arise and where things could go wrong. And this is going back quite a number of years. But over 10 years ago now, Tesco had overstated its half-year profits by at least, I think, 250, maybe up to 300 million pounds. And it triggered a sharp market fallout. It was market abuse. It wiped off maybe 1.5 billion of shareholder value, led to a fine of about 130 million, a deferred prosecution agreement. 3 years after the event, one of their senior individuals came out and said, look, we sincerely regret the issues of misleading the market. And it made me just think about the concept of leadership accountability. So I think right from the starting point of leadership accountability could be saying, look, we need to have in place this crisis playbook before the event happens. So accepting this could happen. But what's the advice to you to organisations that they say they face an allegation, say market abuse? What's your position on leadership accountability? Do you say to organisations, look, we need to front up. We may not have all the facts now, but we need to own this. What would you be putting in a crisis playbook?
I mean, there's two things here. It's basically just like, are they culpable or not? Certainly, to your point, you need to be front footed in the first instance, so to be out there and transparent. And obviously, something like that situation, which, as I don't understand all the nuances, but as I understand it, it was a quite technical and lots of financial things which needed analysing. So I think people understand you need to go through and analyse them. But I think if you then arrive at a situation where you know you are culpable, and obviously you need to do this in conjunction with lawyers, but then I think is get ahead of it, and you get out. And obviously, once again, these are the caveats of speaking to lawyers, but actually you want to be the ones apologising first, rather than, you then have the regulators coming out going, you've been hit with a fine. And then it looks very reactionary. Actually, if you get ahead of it, you will get some credit for that. I think often in these situations where we see people go wrong is that apology is qualified as opposed to being unconditional. And I know people say, and I agree, understandable. So once again, there'll be sometimes legal confines you could be working within, but to really consider that, because there's nothing worse than a non-apology or a qualified apology, which then forces you to have to go back again, and it lacks sincerity. In a time, take someone like Tesco's, where consumers can mobilize a lot more online. You see a lot of movement of consumers looking to boycott products.
Sure.
They can vote with their feet. So I think really, really important. And I think, as also just to reiterate the two other points there, like, when these things happen, is what are you communicating to your stakeholders? What are you communicating to your staff? Because obviously staff retention and huge organisation like that's really important, what you're doing with morale. And then the issue as ever is, how do you move beyond that? What's the plan going forward in terms of building up trust again, whether that's around transparency around pay, whether that's around your social footprint, whether that's what you're doing in the community, but also how you're dealing with the regulator going forward. And we see it with some clients, some people a lot better. They're dealing with the regulator than others, and actually just trying to be in constant communication with them. And sometimes, and I appreciate this won't be applicable to a lot of things, but in those organisations, there's also some like Tesco's, and they do this, is having a very front-footed approach in terms of politicians and being transparent and engaging with people across the political spectrum, so they know what you're doing. So there's a clear understanding of the business. Sometimes you find these situations where there hasn't been that engagement in situations, and there's a perception amongst politicians it's low-hanging fruit, and obviously they have parliamentary privilege to say what they want, right? But it can be more damaging. And you have then the whole spectrum of people being hauled in front of select committees, which can then become existential for chief execs who then lose their job. Especially if they're, I think we're listed companies, it's huge. So yeah, I understand that, it's not a one size fits all, and it's, but those are some basic principles to lean back on.
And you made that really useful point in terms of how leadership might want to think about responding, and qualified apologies are not perhaps the best way. I think you may, just as a layperson, maybe watching politics, I get the impression you get a lot of deflection. So you'll ask one question, you'll answer another. Is that another one of those facets of things not to do? Maybe that's a good way of looking at this. What are the things not to do? Don't give a qualified apology if you are going to apologise. Is deflection worse as well?
I mean, it can be. I mean, obviously, once again, you judge. Each situation is different. But yeah, you can look shifty and look like you're obfuscating in these situations. I mean, sometimes there can be a case when the premise of the question might be slightly misunderstanding or wrong, and you can then, we said to people, you can say, look, I think actually the question you should be asking, or that this is the question which goes to the heart of the issue. But the overriding principle to what you're asking, Aaron, is be as transparent as possible, and people are very much on red alert, and you do not want to be going out and making that apology again. And not to spend too long on politics, but when Mandelson came out in January to apologise about his relationship with Epstein, it was a qualified apology, And he was like, I apologize if blah blah. But he had to go out and issue another apology later on. And so it looks like it lacks sincerity, and you made the story 10 times worse, and you've kept the story going for longer. So instead, when you say sometimes you need to cauterize the wound, and this is why we say get everything out at once, but also deal with it in one go.
And when you really focus on that kind of point of transparency, so again, thinking about organisations facing regulatory investigations of wrongdoing, you want to come out and be transparent. You want to, I suppose, get a hold of the market, but you've got to balance the ongoing investigation procedures. So there may be live criminal activity charges, maybe underlying civil corporate claims. How do you balance that from your role? Because I think that must be a really tough line to tread between balancing transparency but ongoing investigations.
Yeah, I mean, our advice, if people are in a pre-charge period, then there's a few sort of basic things we say to them, and is that you don't need to comment on them in the pre-charge period, as you'll know, because people have a right to privacy in a pre-charge period. The public interest in reporting it isn't there. The mistake people make is by commenting. So often the press know what's going on, but they realise they can't, due to privacy, really mention these charges because they didn't mention the fact they've been questioned, not charged. But the mistake people make sometimes is by publicly commenting, and then it allows them to run the story. I think also we're like, look, in these situations, if you are under investigation by a regulator or by the police, is that you need that letter ready to go from the media lawyer that's written, setting out the right to privacy. So if that call comes in with the PR people, can get it out straight away. So you can preempt a lot of this stuff. And usually that will work in 95% of the situations. I think also when you're in that situation, it's just ensuring that you're getting lots of positive content going out from your own platforms, that your first page of Google looks good, that you're flooding a positive comment. Google prioritizes images and videos and getting out there, but also thinking about who are your third-party advocates who can go out, who can make the case for what you do, about why you are a good business, why you are a good organization, as well. So yes, you're right, it's a balancing act, and in that pre-charge period I would say wait, because often people, in the case is not continued or it's dropped, and therefore you can end up making the situation 10 times worse. And there is that, I mean, you make a wide point, there is that Streisand effect which people talk about. There's a judgment call on these things. Obviously you want to give an unqualified apology, then you want to move on, right? Sometimes people can make things worse if you carry on talking about it.
Yeah, I could see that. I've seen instances where people will continue to keep talking about it to try and, I suppose, justify after the event, even though they've made the admission. And that other point you landed on earlier in one of your responses, you said about proactive and sincere communications, how this can actually give you an advantage. And we've seen examples where organisations have responded with ownership of the issue, accepted they've done something wrong. And that's led to either deferred prosecution agreements, it's led to lower sanctions, reduced penalties. Recently with EFCA and finding of one large retail bank with AML failings, but the bank came forward and said, yeah, we got this wrong. And they was very, very much on the front foot, managing it in a quite responsible manner, and they got reduced sanctions. Is that like the golden ground for you? Is that brilliant where you have a client comes up to you and says, look, let's just be absolutely honest about what's happened here. How can we take advantage of our mistake with the use of PR?
Yeah, I think then it comes down to how do you show that you have made the changes? It's like it's all well and good.
Yeah.
Actions speak louder than the words. It's show not tell a bit. It's like, okay, lean into it. Be fulsome in your apology, but also show what structures have you or processes have you put in place to ensure this won't happen again, which then offers reassurance for the regulator and the public, and shows that it isn't just rhetoric that happens. So I think you'll see all these public inquiries at the moment, which often go on for years and years and years, which are important to get to the truth of what's happened. But I think what's really important to come out of them are what are the material changes which are going to happen, which sometimes I don't think we hear. I know this is a wider point, but I think it does apply to these situations. Is actually and then being more and more transparent about that. And I think from a staff retention point of view, you see that when people are looking where they want to go, especially more graduates, they're looking at the sort of CSR, ESG, whatever you want to call
Yeah.
it, the behavior of big organizations. It's becoming a question. It's a question. I think it's post-war, like since Trump's got in, people say it's less of a question, but it's still a question. It comes up in shareholder meetings, etc. So that conduct of how generally you're behaving and what you're doing, beyond just making money, is still very important in these big organizations.
And when an organisation takes that ownership of the situation, and they have to accept they've done something wrong, they say so. If you look across, be it politics, you look across business and responses, where organisations have admitted and have not deflected, have not qualified apologies. Do you find that memories of the, I suppose, public opinion, as we're framing it for today, memories are short? They just forget. People move on. They accept an apology and move on. Whereas it's where it seems like it's elongated. People remember this for a long, long time.
Generally, yes. I mean, the one caveat I'd say is that we live in a 24-hour news environment more than ever, where there is so much information. You have information overload. So sometimes people get away with stuff when they probably haven't conducted themselves in the best way. But yeah, generally, as a rule of thumb, those organizations who deal with things well are important. I think also it's difficult sometimes. Organizations want to rush to comment on. You also have, I mean, there is a balancing act here. I've seen organizations wanting to rush to comment on everything, like get involved in stuff in the political arena or like social issues, and you sort of say to them, this is okay, but you better make sure your house is, you know what I mean, that you're, I don't know, say they want to get involved in issues around gender pay. It's like, you better make sure that you have a 50-50 split in your company. You better make sure that you've got measures in place which ensure this happens. You better make sure your history is really good on this. So yeah, there's also, we do live in a world now, and I have some sympathy with politicians, where everyone expects you to have a view on everything, and you don't.
Yeah,
I think sometimes people need to step back and appreciate that, very much on a case-by-case basis.
And now we live in this kind of age where not only you've got to have an opinion on everything, you've got to be mindful of all the risks out there at the same time. So we kind of drift into that area of fake news and false allegations. And saw the Conservative MP George Freeman in the deep fake video back in October 25 about him moving across to Reform, and that defection was announced, and it was all complete fake news. And then there was a bit of a groundswell. It picked up in social media very quickly. And we see it with fake news as well, allegations coming around which just are not true, really good imagery, content creation. How do you advise an organisation to stay ahead of the curve of dealing with fake news that could impact on shareholder value, could impact on reputation?
I think it's firstly, it's the crisis mitigation. It's creating that crisis comms infrastructure which will deal with all the different scenarios if this happens, if that happens. And that says you can preempt 90-95% of the stuff. So you have answers ready for those things. Secondly, and having, as we said, the war book in place, which has processes, timelines, how you're going to deal with stuff in the eventuality of what's going on. Second, it comes back to my earlier point, your own channels are really, really important. So you can say, look, this is where you get the unfiltered truth from. So using those effectively. Thirdly, it is, we live in a 24-hour news environment, so it's the monitoring. You need to have round-the-clock monitoring and rapid rebuttal to get on top of stuff. I think also using your own websites to have Q&As, Mythbusters, to be putting stuff out on there. Also comes down to having good, strong relationships with the media and with credible news sources, so you can use them to put out your statements, to rebut stuff, so people can see something's not true. And Google does prioritize this, because Google is obviously acutely aware of this, and it does try and prioritize traditional news sources on its first page. So having those strong relationships, obviously using third-party advocates to rebut stuff, using lawyers like yourself, but then also the platforms will take stuff down. So, using people who have good relationships with those platforms, or yourself, they will take stuff down as well. And this is where having a good online footprint is important, so you can rebut stuff quickly. But it is an ongoing thing. Yeah, you're seeing it more and more. And as you touched upon, the explosion of AI makes it a lot more difficult.
Yeah, and I was trying to, out of all of these webinars, trying to do some research. It was interesting. I was trying to find research where had any competitors of one another used fake news, fake information. Obviously, that's causing economic harm. It leads to all kinds of civil disputes. But it seems like it's created by people who've actually got no skin in the game, but they are just out there to cause damage. And that.
And it can be sometimes if you have the odd thing, like someone who's got 18 followers on Twitter, and normally be like, ignore it. But it's on a case by case basis, because you can make things worse. But yes, it comes down to, you need to have 24-hour media monitoring or tracking if you're an organisation, which is public facing in any way.
And what happens if you're an organisation that essentially can't budget for that? What do you do? So, there are organisations that will get caught up in a little bit of litigation or a bit of criminal investigation, unfortunately, but they don't have that type of budget. Is there the option for that kind of mid-tier organisation? What do they do?
Well, I think there is, like I said, there's direct contract with the platforms, there's using your own channels, and there's using traditional media channels on which to get stuff out. And if there is a criminality to what if there are criminal allegations to what they're saying, which are totally untrue, sometimes telling the police. So
yeah, and sometimes, obviously, we go away from fake news and fake stories. You then have the actual situations where you do have the SFO come knocking. We saw the SFO have gone in on an organisation linked to some housing association issues last week. We see a number of FCA type of investigations, and these investigations do take time. I think the point you're getting across is media cycles are fast, regulatory investigations are slow. So whilst those regulatory investigations are on foot, something's happening. There must be a do's and don'ts kind of columns of what you're not to do. And I know we were chatting before, and you'd made reference to, and it's nothing to do with fraud or financial crime, but you made reference to Russell Brand, and he'd done an interview the other night with Piers Morgan, and you basically said everything that he has done, maybe not everything, but most things he's done are in the don't do column. So if you've got an ongoing regulatory investigation, an ongoing criminal investigation, just even using Russell Brand saying, what don't you do, and what should you do, in your experience?
Yeah, and I think if it's an ongoing sort of SFO regulatory investigation, if you've not been charged, and I know these things take a long time, then it's not commenting on the case if you ask, and injuncting and using the right to privacy just through the lawyers on that. The Russell Brand case, yeah, he did probably what everyone would say, just do not do. So obviously we know he's been charged, very serious allegations, and he did an hour-long interview with Piers Morgan on Friday, where they didn't touch upon the case, because obviously it's live proceedings, but they did talk about his behavior in the past, his sexual promiscuity, and in my view, he said a lot of ill-judged things. He was quite flippant about some of the stuff he'd done in the past. I think he smirked on a couple of occasions, and so for me, that's incredibly damaging. His sexual behavior is up in court. He's been charged with obviously very serious offences, and going on, even if it's talking about unrelated things, but in relation to his behavior, I don't think bodes well. And I think it's problematic. And I think, obviously they'll want a jury who hasn't heard of Russell Brand, hasn't seen Russell Brand. That might be quite hard because he has been ubiquitous, and it's very well known. So I think that was ill-judged. Look, I think in these situations, you can be putting your own content online, which measures just not about the case, but about the business and its conduct, the good things you're doing, and that's the way to handle it, but it has to be done on your own terms and controlled. Yeah, doing something like that, and will that, and I'm not an expert in these situations, I'm not a lawyer, but I can't imagine a judge would be very happy about him being able to do that interview either, in these situations. So it's definitely a don't. If things are live, there's still stuff that you can be doing from a media perspective, but it's got to be very controlled and thought through.
And we've talked a lot about what you do externally. You've talked about Mythbusters, Q&A, you're talking about using Google and so on. But you've also referenced briefly the internal part of communications. And it often seems to me that, not losing morale, productivity in the workplace is absolutely vital when you're in a business that's in a crisis. You're likely to suffer some hit financially. What you need is your people to be standing with you and be productive and aligned. What's in the playbook? So you've got whatever the allegation is against a business, say it's a corruption allegation, some employees may not care, some might. What's the playbook for how you deal with things internally? Say it's a business that's got over 1,000 employees. What are you saying to them about getting this right in that crisis playbook for the internal comms?
Yeah, I think it's often like, even if nothing's moved, so you still investigate, you don't have any information, it's just having updates every day, being transparent, being on the front foot with them. As I said, journalists now can get to these employees so much quicker now, because whether it's on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, they can contact people, and vice versa, in a way that traditionally it was a lot harder previously for journalists to get to these people and for whistleblowers or staff to get to them. And just to sort of broaden this out a bit, if you take the COVID, what happened during COVID about media handling, just some principles, or the horse meat scandal. I don't know if you remember that scandal in 2013. But I thought with COVID, the mistake the government made was this. So it was important they had a press conference every day for transparency, for frequency of information. But the mistake they did was they had the press conference at 5 o'clock every day. So you then had, after that press conference, they'd have media speculation all the way up to 5 o'clock, sometimes quite destabilizing, misinformation, which was causing panic. I think in that situation, what they should have done is in the morning, they should have said you're going to have 2 media briefings a day. In the morning, you're going to have a briefing from the scientists, right? And they're just going to equip you with all the latest facts and figures. Now, and the rationale for doing that would be like, the scientists could be up and they'd be going, I'm not politicians, so we're not here to talk about the politics. We're here to talk about the raw facts, the science. And so you are, up to speed with all relevant information. That way, you'd have stopped the destabilizing speculation up till 5 o'clock. You'd have had more control over the news cycle. With the horse meat scandal and something like 2013, once again, it's about, even if nothing's moving, actually you do need to have the frequency of putting someone out on the media to ensure there is a level of transparency to reassure people. And I think the government could have said at that point, there are only 2 briefings you should pay attention to during the day. And it's going to be the one at 5 o'clock and the one at 11 o'clock. And that's it. And there's going to be no off the record briefings or anything like that. I think all the stuff which was attributed to sources and all that speculation was really, really destabilizing. I know this is quite particular and is applicable to public health scandal, but that's obviously where you've got a lot of stuff online and fake news being spread. And in that sense, it's like, because the government, you have a bit, in one way, you have a bit more control over how you're going to handle the flow of information.
So that's really important, that kind of retaining that narrative control and without prejudicing, I suppose, wider issues. And then if you have a situation though that where you've got this, like at the top of the webinar, we talked about, you put out a statement saying, look, we're going to get all our information, we're investigating it thoroughly, then we will tell you everything in one go. In between, there is a large period of silence. And speculation will continue to be rife. What do you do if you take that approach? How do you manage that speculation period and where you're not going to comment? How do you challenge the silence? Is there anything that can be done?
No, it's difficult. I think you say with organisations, as much as you can convey business as normal, ensuring that you're getting as much positive content out as possible, and where applicable, using third-party advocates, ambassadors, surrogates, who can just talk to the general good behavior of the business. And I think also just people need to make, it doesn't always happen like this, and each situation can be different, but sometimes you will get, after that initial media tsunami, a bit of breathing space, because the caravan will move on, and there'll be other stories which erupt. And it's sort of understanding that there's a fine line between feeding the story, being transparent. Okay, look, we will come back to you with everything. But eventually, in those situations, the media will be like, right, we're going to go on something else because it's not a fresh line here. And you've been very, as long as you've been very upfront, doing stuff. As ever in those situations, you have to account for what stuff might leak out and what you're going to do in that situation. You might have the report ready to go, and it might leak 24 hours beforehand or 40 hours. So what's the, you always need to be mitigating for these situations. If that happens, we'll have to bring forward, for instance, the press conference we're going to do, or the public statements, or the media we're going to do. So always allowing for that. But I think, generally the media will move on. They'll come back to it, but you will get some breathing space.
Yeah, and I guess that's the reality of human nature, isn't it? We balloon things up. We think everybody's only going to have time to think about our issue, where everyone's got their own lives, their own businesses, and things will move on. Now, we're going to come on to the section about rebuilding a reputation, and then do some question and answers. So if anyone's got any questions, please put them in the chat. And also there'll be a feedback form that'll come across as well. Actually, I might just delve in, because I can see there's a question there at the moment. Maybe I'll deal with that now before we go on to rebuilding a reputation, because I think it links together. The question is, to what extent do you, and this is a politics question, Giles, to what extent do you think that a large part of the problem is the lack of deterrence in terms of public life, professional life? It is used, in terms of public life, professional life, it used to be the case that if found out being dishonest, that was a career-ending event, no comeback, etc. That seems to have completely changed over a 50-year period, with all manner of comebacks. Do you think that lack of deterrence, in terms of, look, if you get caught out, you're telling lies, you're going to resign, but you can come back again? What's your take on that? Do you think that in public life, do you think people just say, look, if you get caught lying, that's it, it's done?
Yeah, I think, and we should be more clear-cut and brutal about it. And I think, without getting too involved in a long political discussion, I think this also explains the fragmentation of the political system, because people, we used to be in a two-party system, now effectively we're in a five-party system. Why is that vote fragmenting? Because people are fed up with the mainstream, same old two political parties. They feel like are not serving them and not being transparent. So they are seeking and going elsewhere for looking for other people who can provide answers. So those traditional allegiances are breaking down. So to point out, and I think people are fed up. And I said, if you poll people generally about what are the most important issues, what do they think, certainly about public institutions, lack of trust, lack of respect for the integrity of the office, politicians not realizing they are just temporary holders of that office. I think, just to put out a global context, it's interesting. I think in America, you're allowed to have one scandal and come back, and everyone likes a redemption story. I think here we're a bit less forgiving, but you're right. There has been too much people not carrying the can and taking accountability for what they've done.
And so we get to this kind of final sections, rebuilding a reputation. Now, let's take the Tesco example. They got their 85 million fine to help those who'd suffered damage from the market abuse. They had obviously had a deferred prosecution agreement. They want to get back on their feet, or it's another organisation that's been found foul of wrongdoing, dishonesty, or an individual. How long's that runway in your mind? When someone sends that, they sit down with you, Giles, right, okay, we've seen the decision, we've been fined this much, we've made an apology now, but it's 3 years after the event. How long's our runway? What we're looking at, Giles, to get people to think nicely of us again?
I think it's difficult to give a time to Aaron, because each situation is different. With an organisation like Tesco's, which is employs thousands of people, it's effectively a multinational, the spotlight and scrutiny is going to be a lot greater on them. So they are going to have to go that extra yard in terms of rebuilding what they're doing, rebuilding trust, and then what do they have to do? I mean, these are just basic principles, but as we said, the apologies shouldn't be qualified. They need to be consistent in absolutely everything they do. They need to be more transparent than everyone. They need to be going further when it comes to what they're doing around pay and recruitment. They need to be doing more than others when it comes to what they're doing in their local communities, because they are in every local community. What they're doing around their social media footprint. I suppose the thing we'd say to them is, you've done the apology, now it's time to move on. Don't let it define you. And the way you don't let it define you is what your actions are going forward from there, and have, your best ambassadors are the people you employ. So how you treat them and what you're doing around that. And also, what are you doing which makes you stand out next to your competitors? Where's your point of difference on this? And obviously, say someone like Tesco is incredibly exposed, publicly listed company. I think the other thing in these situations what they have to do also is rebuild relationships with the regulator, but also with politicians. I mean, as ever, building that cross-party consensus on what you're doing is really, really important. To say, even if you do mess up, people can understand what kind of business you are, that this isn't something you normally do, that you have some redeeming characteristics. It's often when people don't know much about business, you'll see politicians wade in. And, we say to people, look, it's, now, I mean, we could have a reformed government in 2-3 years' time. It's pressing on people where they might intersect with the political arena to have those relationships across the political spectrum, because you just don't know what might happen. And we live in a political system where the level of volatility is just going up and up and up.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, right now there's real uncertainty on the political front. With this impression of rebuilding a reputation, and talking about all the good things you do, you say, don't let it define you. But there's something about, certainly where I've seen it with AML failings, or these money laundering failings within financial services institutions. One of the main reactions is the amount of investment they are publicly talking about, they're putting into the area that caused them the problem in the first place. It's that part of it every time. They look, what has caused us the issue? Let's talk about all the good we're going to kind of invest into making sure it doesn't happen again. And in a weird way, can that turn you into a thought leader in your area of, like, be your sector? Can you spin maybe stronger, but can you galvanize that to be a real positive to drive your business in the future?
Yeah, provided you're not being a hypocrite and you're not becoming, I suppose, positioning yourself as the kind of moral guardian of the nation. Yes, I think you can lean into these things and actually show how you've learned from your mistakes, but you need to avoid some kind of lecturing, hectoring tone, which people hate anyway, but also it lacks sincerity and people don't want to be lectured. But yes, you can pivot off it and exactly use it to build out a positive platform.
Okay, yeah. No, I think, I like that point. I think people might forget that people will have memories. So when you start preaching about, look at all this great stuff, someone might say, hey, remember that fun you got back there? Before we pop onto some questions, just to round up, is there anything else that you would think that we haven't touched on, which is really useful for organisations to know if they've got allegations, or they've got allegations of wrongdoing, or they've got some civil fraud dispute, they've got some issue in terms of internal, external PR management? Is there anything else you think is worth mentioning?
Just to reiterate, I think every organisation should have a risk register where you go through and you map out all the potential problems you could be hit with, even ones which seem quite unlikely. And I think what we think now is that even organisations who aren't public facing, who traditionally would think, I don't need to have a crisis comms plan in place or anything like that, if you hold any amount of data and you could be subject to a hack of some sort, then you should have in place an infrastructure and a risk register and a plan if things happen, because you will make things, you cannot be devising a crisis comms plan, I said earlier on, when you're in the middle of it. If you have everything set up, then it will be 10 times easier. And as I said, you can preempt 90% of what you might get hit. Not everything, stuff comes out of the left field, but it is really preparation is key at preempting the stuff and putting in all those places. And then I think just constantly reviewing them, given the pace of change when it comes to technology and the geopolitical volatility and what's happening to regulation in the world, to ensure that it's up to speed. So that doesn't need to be all the time, but every 6 months, thinking about just checking in and making sure that is there stuff need to be added to the risk register, maybe stuff might want to be taken off as you go.
That's really helpful. It kind of chimes into one of the questions we've got here, which is, we've got many instances we've talked about on this session about where there has been a crisis. We've talked about it through politics, we've talked about it through business. The question is, why do you think organisations, governments are reluctant to develop simple and straightforward crises playbooks? So you're advocating that they should do it. That would be written. The person asking the question saying, look, this will really help in the time of a crisis, a simple communication strategy through to accountability reviews, rather than people simply resigning. It's a bit like when we talk about, on occasion we talk about fraud prevention work, it's an invisible ROI. No one can see the benefit of trying to set up the response plan or the prevention. How do you persuade organisations to do this? Because it's obviously, to me, it makes sense. To you, it makes sense. But it seems that lots of organisations don't have these crisis playbook in place.
I think to your point, why didn't do it? You're right, because if it hasn't happened for them, they can't see the ROI. So if you're publicly listed, your share price is going to slide. So that's going to be a massive problem for them. Sometimes there's hubris around it. Why should they do it? Because, to my point, obviously everyone could be hit by a data hack now. Every one of your employees has the potential to be a journalist, right? So they've got their own social media platforms. So often you've seen stuff go viral from organizations which aren't public facing, but from bad employee relations going wrong. And we've seen how bad employee relations can become existential for big brands. And so I think we live in a world where you're a lot more exposed now, whether you like it or not. Even if you are public facing, you need to have that infrastructure in place, to minimize the risk.
So for everyone on this call, people going back to if they're in an organisation, go back and start to invest in this, and obviously have a chat to Giles and Trafalgar Strategy. Well, Giles, look, we've blasted through 55 minutes really quickly. Thank you so much for giving up your time to everyone today.
Thanks for having me.
I really appreciate it, and thank you to everyone who's attended, who stayed on as well for the full hour. There is a feedback form if you have got time for that, be it after the session or during the end of it. Our contact details are there as well. You'll get the ebook, the copy of the recording sent out in the next week or two. Please also follow. We're trying to develop a LinkedIn page for At the Coalface as well, where we'll post previous episodes and the ebooks. In terms of the next episode, that's going to be either on the 8th or the 15th of June at 1 p.m. with Kath Okpata. He is an award-winning journalist and podcast producer. He's been with the BBC News. He was the first under 30-year-old presenting Panorama. He's won awards for his journalism and his work recently with ITV. But he's recently published a book called Scam Nation, Undercover with the Next Generation of Cyber Fraudsters, really looking at a wave of teenagers that are committing huge amount of fraud through cyber attacks and also certainly attacks on retailers and banks. So he's going to be really interesting in terms of his investigation and walkthrough. So to everyone, and Giles, thank you so much for making the time for the webinar today. Appreciate it. Hopefully we'll see you at the next time, and we'll be in touch once again. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys.